Okay, we're in part 4 of chapter 4, The Rape of the Mind, by Just A.M. Merleau. All of a sudden, the enemy puts before you a clash of loyalties. Your father or your friends, your brother or your fatherland, your wife or your honor. This is a brutal choice to have to make. And when the Inquisitor makes use of your additional inner conflicts, he can easily force you into surrender. A clash between loyalties makes either choice a betrayal, and this arouses paralyzing doubt. This calculated but subtle attack on the weakest spots in man's mind, on a man's conscience, and on the moral system he has learned from the Judeo-Christian ethics paralyzes the reason and leads the victim more easily into betrayal. The Inquisitor subtly tests his victim's archaic guilt feelings toward paternal figures, his friends, his children. He cleverly exploits the victim's early ambivalent ties with his parents. The sudden outbreak of hidden moral flaws and guilt can bring a man to tears and complete breakdown. He regresses to the dependency and submissiveness of the baby. A very husky former hero of the Dutch resistance, known as King Kong, because of his size and strength, became the treacherous instrument of the Nazis soon after his brother had been taken with him, and the Nazis threatened to kill the youth. King Kong's final surrender to the enemy and his becoming their treacherous tool was psychiatrically recognizable as a defense mechanism against his deep guilt arising from hidden feelings of aggression against his brother. Another example of breakdown is seen in the story of one young resistance fighter who, after the Nazis had threatened to torture his father, who was imprisoned with him, finally broke into childish tears and promised to tell them everything they wanted to know. After that, he was taken back to his cell in order to be softened up again the following day. This was the routine of his interrogator. The Inquisitors understood only too well the effectiveness of patient pursuit at repeated moments while intruding into a man's guilt feelings. Although both prisoners were liberated that night as a consequence of the Allied sweep through Belgium and the southward west of Holland, the boy remained in his depression for a long time, tortured by his knowledge that he had nearly betrayed his best friends in the underground in order to save his father, in spite of knowing at the same time that the promises of the enemy would not have protected his father. In the subsequent psychological exploration of the boy's breakdown in depression, his dreams gave us a clue to his long-buried aggressive fantasies against his father, whom he had symbolically killed in his dreams. The sense of guilt about his unconscious infantile hostility had weighed more heavily on his conscience than the possibility of being guilty toward his fellow partisans. A conscious understanding of what his difficulties had been, plus renewed military activity, did much to help him cope with the conflicts that tortured him. But other unwilling traitors were less fortunate. When finally they realized the enormity of their betrayal, several of them became psychotically depressed, and some even committed suicide. The law of survival versus the law of loyalty. The prisoners of war in Korea, who gradually gave in to the systematic mental pressure of the enemy and collaborated in the production of materials that could be used for communist propaganda, albeit tentatively and for only as long as they were in the orbit of the enemy, followed a peculiar psychological law of passive inner defense and inner deceit that when one cannot fight and defeat the enemy, one must join him. Later, a few of them were so taken in by totalitarian propaganda that they elected to remain in China and the totalitarian orbit. Some did it to escape punishment for having betrayed their comrades. Man cannot become a turncoat without justifying his actions to himself. When Holland surrendered to the German army in 1940, I saw this general mechanism of mental surrender operating in several people who had been staunch anti-Nazis. Maybe there is something good in Nazism, they told themselves as they saw the tremendous show of German strength. Those who were the victims of their own initial mental surrender and need to justify things, who could not stop and say to themselves, "Hold on here, think this out," became the traitors and collaborators. They were completely taken in by the enemy's show of strength. The same process of self-justification and justifying the enemy started in the POW camps. Experiences from the concentration camps gives us some indication of how far this passive submission to the enemy can go. Because of the deep-seated human need for affection, many prisoners lived only for one thing: a friendly word from their guards. Each time it came, it fortified the delusion of grace and acceptance. Once these prisoners, mostly those who had been in the camps a long time, were accepted by the guards, they easily became the trusted tools of the Nazis. They started to behave like their cruel jailers and became torturers of their fellow campers. These collaborating prisoners, called capos, were even more cruel and vengeful than the official overseers. Because of misunderstood inner needs, the brainwasher and sadistic camp leader is direly in need of collaborators. They serve not only for the propaganda machine, but also to exonerate their jailers from guilt. When a man has to choose either hunger, death marches, and torture, or a temporary yielding to the illusions of the enemy, his self-preservation mechanisms act in many ways like reflexes. They help him to find 1,000 justifications and exculpations for giving in to the psychological pressure. One of the officers court-martialed for collaborating with the enemy in a Korean POW camp justified his conduct by saying that he followed this course of action in order to keep himself and his men alive. Is that not a perfectly valid, though not necessarily true, argument? The use of it serves to point up the fact that self-protective mechanisms are usually much stronger than ideological loyalty. No one who has not faced this same bitter problem can have an objective opinion as to what he himself would do under the circumstances. As a psychiatrist, I suggest that most people would yield and compromise when threat and mental pressure became strong enough. Among the anti-Nazi undergrounds in the Second World War were physically strong boys who thought they could resist all pressure and would never betray their comrades. However, they could not even begin to imagine the perfidious technique in menticide. Repeated pestering itself is more destructive than physical torture. The pain of physical torture, as we have said, brings temporary unconsciousness and consequently forgetfulness. But when the victim wakes up, the play of anticipation begins. Will it happen again? Can I stand it any more? Anticipation paralyzes the will. Suicidal thoughts and identification with death do not help. The foe doesn't let you die, but drags you back from the very edge of oblivion. The anticipation of renewed torture increases internal anxieties. Who am I to stand all this? Why must I be a hero? Gradually, resistance breaks down. And we'll stop it right there. That was Chapter 4, Part 4, The Rape of the Mind.